You are listening to the MindPod Network. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Sunrise CBD, conscious CBD crafted for wellness at honest prices. SunriseCBD.com. It's all happening. 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 It's all Hello, friends. Welcome back to the It's All Happening podcast, episode 136 of the show. This is Zach Leary. I'm your host. So happy to be back with you guys. I know it's been a long break. On this episode of the podcast, we have Miko Matsumura, who is a genius entrepreneur, venture capitalist, tech theorist, and all-around wizard for the 21st century. I'm going to tell you a little story about my life. Just this past weekend, I was seeing Dead & Company at the Shoreline Amphitheater in Mountain View, California. And as the pattern repeats itself, towards the end of the second set, I get a little bit tired and I want to sit down in my chair. And as I did, the band started playing Wharf Rat, which is a great way to round out the second set and begin to weave the sounds of closure. And as they were playing the song, instantly, my whole life started flashing before my eyes. I felt this profound and really potent sense of deja vu that there I was, sitting at Shoreline or any amphitheater, listening to Grateful Dead music again, listening to Wharf Rat again, listening to the words again, and I realized that I really don't remember my life before the Grateful Dead was such an integral part of my life. And all the people that are gone, all the people that I miss, all the people that have faded away, started to appear in my mind's eye and in my heart. I realize it's a really far out thing that human beings, when we gather around the campfire and share stories and poetry and become part of a tribe, that we use other people's poetry and other people's art to express our feelings and our emotions. And in some ways, it really emphasizes the phenomenon that we are all in this together. Someone else can make a song or a film or a piece of art that tells my story, right? But as this was happening, I thought deeply, so deeply, about this person who has broken my heart, who I allowed to break my heart, and thought about this person who inflicted such cruelty and pain onto me, and replayed this last year, and thought about my own behavior and my own what happened on my side of the street that created an environment in which this person needed to treat me like this, And euphoric recall, that seductive mistress of euphoric recall, makes you forget the reality of the situation, makes you forget the reality that says when someone treats you like this, that they're not your friend, they don't care about you, move on. euphoric recall will ignore that and tell you and show you all the great things that you want back in your life with this person. But whether or not that's true, I don't know. I thought about her beautiful 5-year-old boy who I miss so much, who I didn't really get a chance to keep on being an influence to, who just got snatched away from a situation that I thought was beautiful and stable, and I was really doing some good for him. And that profound sense of loneliness, that profound sense of feeling that it's not going to change, is a really, really difficult thing to reckon with. But then the song said, I'll get back on my feet again someday, the good Lord willing, if he says I may. I know that the life I'm living's no good. I'll get a new start, live the life I should. I'll get up and fly away. I'll get up and fly away. Apologies if anybody thought that was a downer of any kind or self-indulgent. It is what it is. I use this podcast from time to time as a sandbox to express myself and to sort of generate an understanding of the situations, good, bad, or otherwise, that I face in life. So we're going to get into the podcast in a second, but now a word from our sponsor. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Sunrise CBD. Conscious CBD, crafted for wellness at honest prices. Did you know that archaeologists discovered remnants of hemp cloth in ancient Mesopotamia, which dates back to 8000 BC? Hemp is also believed to be the oldest example of human industry. And today, as you all know, CBD is derived from hemp. It's been used in China for thousands of years. Hemp has been grown in France for 700 years continuously, and of course, was one of the preeminent crops in the early days of the American experiment, used to make paper, cloth, rope, all sorts of things. But as the 20th century rolled around, hemp found itself in the epicenter of corporate agendas that were hyper-focused on this new synthetic petroleum-based product that wanted to put them out of business. And of course there was reefer madness, but that's another story. But rest assured, with all the chaos in the world today, there is some good news. Hemp is back, and Sunrise CBD is growing their hemp organically in Colorado, and their quality and purity is confirmed by independent third-party labs. It's legal in all 50 states. Their products can provide relief from pain, inflammation, insomnia, anxiety, all sorts of things. So this is pure CBD at honest prices. There's a money-back guarantee. The only requirement is that you tell them why you weren't happy so they can learn and improve. It's good stuff. Go to sunrisecbd.com. Check out their whole plethora, their whole universe of mind, body, and soul-changing products. sunrisecbd.com. Big thank you to our sponsor. So, Miko Matsumura. If you go to his website, miko.com, miko.com, you can see all the things that he does on the outside. He is a successful venture capitalist that is focused on cryptocurrencies and emerging technologies within that space. A fantastic speaker, advises startups and does all sorts of things, and has really been involved in a very, very high level in Silicon Valley for quite a while. And, you know, there are a lot of successful people in Silicon Valley, no doubt about it. But what attracts me to Miko is his view of, I shouldn't say his view, but his kind of spiritual practice, his perception of how technology exists within the communal consciousness, and the end user's role in how tech affects the individual and thus our society. It's really groundbreaking. He is a brilliant mind and just a brilliant heart, a brilliant soul. And I don't know him very well, but the time that I have spent with him has always been it's been mind-blowing. And I kind of get intimidated by him. He is a big brain person and a big heart person. And our conversation really surfed the waves of really his sweet spot. We talked a lot about cryptocurrencies and the global economy and how that relates to you and I and all sorts of things. I think you'll really enjoy this podcast. Miko Matsumura. Take it away, Miko. Miko, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks so much. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to do it with you in person too. And by default, being a technologist, I do so many technologists, over Skype or something. But it's great to be with you in person and share the humanity.
Yeah, and it probably results in a nicer sound, so it's good.
So I wanted to start. We can get into so many places, but given your expertise in blockchain and cryptocurrencies and how that relates to community, right, and peer-to-peer relationships and empowering the individual, I think it's safe to say that for, the common person, the average person, there's a general distrust of the global financial industry, that it favors one side over the other. And we're seeing, obviously, great wealth disparity and things like that. And when a meltdown that happened like in 2008 with the crash of Lehman Brothers and things like that, most people don't really understand what even happened. Something just happened and then it affected their life and mortgage rates and income, whatever, So how, from your perspective, how can we rebuild trust and a general understanding of how to make the global financial system work for every single person?
Yeah, that is such a core issue, and to me it brings us back to 10 years ago, and it was really September 15, 2008, essentially the beginning of the end of Lehman Brothers. So largest bankruptcy in human history, wow. $600 billion of balance sheet effectively collapsed and erased. But the thing that became really interesting was that the bleeding didn't stop there, right? So when you think about 600 billion USD, that's really just one bank, and the thing that was really interesting that happened next was the emergence of this platform of quantitative easing, right? Which is essentially these big government programs to essentially bail out these banks that had become too big to fail. And right. It's a little crazy because the idea of them being too big to fail and then having them fail is not comfortable. It's a very uncomfortable place. And it's a very existential place for the world financial system. So to me, looking into that abyss, I think that there are a lot of sentiments that we were very close to, eating grass, right? Which is a very great metaphor for kind of being reduced to thinking about what we can eat, right? And the thing that's fascinating about that metaphor, it's barely even a metaphor when you talk about things like collapse. Because when you look at collapse, it's sort of like people say things like, well, you can't eat gold. So what happens in a collapse of sufficient size is that gold decreases in value, right? Because you're at the point where you're really starting to look primarily at this sort of survival or extinction level, right? So to me, we didn't reach that, right. And we averted that through essentially magically printing money.
That's what quantitative easing is, essentially, right?
Quantitative easing is magic money printing. So you pay people with magic money that you just printed, and that's how we saved the world. But I was not part of that saving. That's how the powers saved the system. But as you know, like, how exactly is that a thing? Like, that's a very wrong or weird feeling of like magic money.
It seems pretty abstract.
Yeah, and so the thing that happened a month later, in October 31st, is that there was the publication, the pseudonymous publication of a white paper on the internet, called Bitcoin by Satoshi Nakamoto, this very mysterious creator. And, a month later, we're reading about this kind of magic internet money, right? So now it's magic internet money competing against magic kind of quantitative easing money, right? So it's really a weird event in human history.
So the creation of the magic internet money at the time, looking in the context of October of 2008,
yes,
right?
2008.
Yeah. So what has always perplexed me about this, and I've had it explained to me. I had Mark Pesce on the podcast once, and I'm still never quite sure if I totally understand it, but you create this magical internet money and this blockchain, but what's at the core of it? Like, it feels like it's money made up of ones and zeros.
Yeah.
But you can extract the money and turn it into fiat. But at the beginning in 2008, what was the core? What was created?
Yeah. So I can explain this blockchain thing.
Yeah.
And, I'll probably explain it in metaphorical terms, but the metaphors really do map very closely to the technical abstractions, which is the best way to look at it is the blockchain is a device for recording a new form of history. Right? So up to the point of the creation of the blockchain, we were dependent on older forms of history. And the typical form of history we were dependent on is basically history that was revisionist, right? So essentially people would, I think one of the things that we're suffering from in the world today is sort of all these things about fake news, and everyone's yelling about how what's being written isn't true. So the thing that has been utterly reliable through all of the ups and downs of Bitcoin is that the transactions recorded on the ledger are a perfect record of what happened, right? And that's very strange. And so the question becomes, how is it that that's even possible, right? It's a very strange thing that has occurred. And the thing that's strange is that we actually have something on the internet that is public and it's world readable, and trillions of dollars have transacted across it, and yet there are zero cases of any person pointing at any transaction and saying successfully, or at least proving successfully, that that's not what happened. So no one has yet been able to point to a single entry and say that's not what happened. And it's like, no, that's what happened.
So it creates transparency.
Yes, and the thing that's crazy about it is that it's essentially a historical recording of a consensual reality, and it's a consensual reality that's produced through what you would expect, consensus, right? Which is basically that it's agreement. So what's happening is everyone is talking to everyone else, and what happens that's kind of amazing in this network is it's literally just a network of computers running this software called Bitcoin. And what happens is that they all broadcast information. So let's say Alice pays Bob 1 Bitcoin, right? So what happens is that Alice broadcasts out to the Bitcoin network and says, hey, I'm paying Bob 1 Bitcoin. Bunch of nodes pick it up. So a bunch of computers running Bitcoin suddenly are like, hey, I just heard that Alice paid Bob 1 Bitcoin. Right, so what happens is that the nodes actually start telling each other that that's what happened, right? And the first time that in Bitcoin you get a message like Alice just paid Bob 1 Bitcoin, every single node assumes that every single other node is lying. So it just receives the message and it puts it on a stack and says, yeah, that's not true. And then what happens is that another person says the same thing. And so what's happening is it just keeps getting confirmations that that's what's happening, because the network is basically all whispering to one another of what happened, and so everyone's telling everyone what happened. Right. And so what happens is it becomes very complicated to lie, because if you start saying, no, Alice paid Bob 2 Bitcoin, right? Like, no one's going to believe you, because every single node is going to have a big stack of messages saying, no, that's not what happened.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And the thing that I think makes it so, to be a little bit like shortcutty, there's a lot of technical juju in here.
Yeah.
But what Satoshi Nakamoto created is almost like a postage system, which is that it actually costs money to say something. And so what ends up happening is that if you want to talk on this network, if you want to lie, you have to basically infect what's called 51% of all the nodes, because if 51% of the nodes say that Alice paid Bob 2 Bitcoins, that becomes the reality, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that it becomes very expensive to lie. That's
right.
Basically.
So like when I do a basic transaction on Coinbase, I think it was something, it's like 6 confirmations are needed.
Yes, confirmations.
Right.
That's exactly what's happening.
And so those 6 confirmations are, okay, that's enough empirical evidence to say that Zach and Alice, in fact, did this transaction.
That's right. And the thing that's beautiful is that like this has been tested, right? It's been very well tested in the sense of the real world has transacted trillions of dollars across this network.
Right.
And it's the network itself has completely succeeded. And when you define it in the terms of the white paper, all they're saying is that this is being done without a trusted third party.
That's my next question.
All that's said. All that they're saying is that there's no trust needed for the third party. And I think that that's a distinction that I think is important.
Very important, very important. And that was my next sort of like segue, was like going back to 2008, and we see this tremendous meltdown of essentially what is the remnants of the old world's financial system that's been built up over generations and generations and so on and so forth, where these third parties are the gateholders, or the gatekeepers, right? A lot of them crash. This white paper comes out. What are the implications of that, though? I mean, I know you can't speak for the entire old school financial system, but what are the implications of that?
Well, it's very, very profound, because to me the thing that's fascinating is that this is really a new system, and the thing that's fascinating that I'm kind of poking at here is that, when I say it's kind of a new way of recording history, we've never had such a history device before. So what's neat about the implications of this concept that people refer to as decentralization is that once you remove the need for a trusted third-party intermediary, it's absolutely what you alluded to before, which is this idea of a peer-to-peer, right? Which is that, and that's the problem that was not solved. So what I mean by the problem was not solved is that second-party trust is not addressed by Bitcoin, or really any cryptocurrency today, which is that Alice has to trust Bob. Alice has to actually figure out that this is actually Bob's true address. And Alice needs to, and the reason why Alice is paying Bob 1 Bitcoin, or was it 2, is that Alice is buying a car from Bob, right? And Bob can still not deliver a car, and Bob can still get the Bitcoin. So what I'm saying is that, like, when people go scams, like, yes, there are boatloads of scams, because there's no solution for the trust of the second party, which is, Alice has to trust Bob. Now, the thing that's interesting about the implications of the network, though, is that what Satoshi didn't say is he didn't say that there wasn't going to be a third party. There are third parties. They just you don't have to trust them, which is amazing, right? So you have this network, and the network basically is untrusted, and yet transactions are flying across it that are trusted. So it's trusted transactions flying across an untrusted network.
But these intermediaries, though, they are essentially just facilitators, though, right? Which makes it different in my eyes.
Yeah, it's not a bank.
Yeah, it's not a bank.
Yes.
Like, I just need it to facilitate my transaction because it has the software and it can extract it.
That's exactly right. So it's for sure not a bank. Bitcoin is not a bank.
Yeah, and the only tremendous meltdowns that I've seen have been dark web oriented stuff where these the Bitcoin wallets disappear when they get shut down or something like that, and when things are in escrow, and that's kind of messed up.
So I think that the things when you reason about trust, I guess. The things that have not been fixed are what's called second party trust, which is basically who am I transacting with, right?
Right.
So, there's two errors there. One error is, Alice sent it to an address, but it turns out that wasn't Bob. It turns out it was Charlie. It turns out that Charlie is actually really clever and somehow got his address kerfuffled in there, and now he's stolen the money, right?
Right.
So, unsolved. That problem has not been solved. So you can accidentally send it to the wrong address. The second nature of the second party trust problem is that Alice could also turn out that Bob wasn't the person Alice thought in a different sense. Alice thought that Bob was the person who was going to give her the car. Right. And it's it turns out Bob is actually the person that's going to take the money and then laugh in her face. Okay, so I guess it wasn't the Bob I thought it was. I thought it was the Bob that was going to give me this car.
But is that something that needs to be fixed? Because philosophically, what I like about this model and the way that you describe it is that, one, it's anonymous. Sure. Mm-hmm. If I say I'm sending it to Charlie or Bob or Alice, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. It's anonymous.
Yes.
Which I like. Two, I would rather, as a society, I would rather us develop implicit trust in one another, than have blind trust in an institution.
Yes, I think that's very meaningful. The thing that I think has been a huge issue that the society has had to grapple with after the collapse of Lehman is something that I kind of think of as sort of a Wizard of Oz problem. Which is that Dorothy shows up and she's like, the wizard is going to save us. It's going to be awesome. And the wizard was at the time Alan Greenspan, right? Right. Which was this kind of godhead of Keynesian economics, right? Which is this concept that the centrality has an all-pervading knowledge that can be used to control the economy. And it turns out that complexity theory says that isn't so. If you model things that are complex, you end up with this concept called the self-organized criticality, which is modeled by avalanches, earthquakes, sand piles, even the human brain and people having nervous breakdowns. These are all, can be simplified in the model of a pile of sand. Right. And so when you think about a self-organized criticality, the thing that's interesting is what caused the avalanche? And people can say, it was the last snowflake. But that's a terrible model of what caused the avalanche, right? And so in a way, the better answer is avalanches are a thing. That's the best answer, right? And so what I'm saying is that an avalanche is an emergent property of a complex nonlinear system. And so what I'm really articulating here is that collapse is inevitable. And so the thing that we have to understand is then how we respond to it. And so I think the interesting thing that happened with Bitcoin is Bitcoin was actually a response to a collapse. And it was essentially an articulation of what if there was an alternative decentralized financial infrastructure, right? Which is a really interesting what if. It's a very interesting supposition. Yeah,
and back to the complexity of the avalanche, Inside Job, that kind of, I don't know if you ever saw that, documented the 2008 crash, and it tried to, paint the picture of two very, very complicated models on credit default swaps and derivatives, things that just got so insanely complicated that the people even using these models and these tools didn't even really understand them, and they just kept doing it anyway.
Absolutely.
Right. So in a way that like the implication, the supposition of what you're saying is that if these avalanches remain so complicated that they're bound to.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable.
Okay.
Because the thing that you have to reason about is that there are thousands of bankers whose job it is to create products. And the products they're creating are essentially derivative products. And what is derivative product? Derivative product is you take something that is known to have a value,
right.
like let's say a currency or a piece of land or whatever. And then what you do is you create a math equation that gives you a different number. Right?
Okay.
And the thing that's great is people buy that number, right? And so, for example, you can create derivatives like, well, we would like to create something based on the Swiss franc in this date in the future. And if the Swiss franc is this price, then you get this much return. And if it's this price, you get a different return. If you get this price, you lose money, right? So it's just a math equation. People are buying that math equation, right? And so what you have is you have thousands of people building these new products that are all designed to generate money. So what's happening is that you're basically squeezing what's called alpha out of this giant sponge, And so the thing that's funny is how does a regulator deal with this? I think, I had a friend who was working at the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. at the time of the collapse. And, the reaction of, I think it was Ben Bernanke at the time was basically like, he explained this concept of CDOs and credit default swaps and things. And he said, they're selling what? So the point being is that the wizards who are supposed to be taking care of everything, like, how could they possibly know what's happening, right? There are thousands of people whose job it is to invent insane things, and they're selling like whatever they're selling, and whatever they're selling is like likely to collapse, right, at some point, because like they just get unmoored from the fundamental value of things like land,
right, and things like land, or at one point the U.S. dollar was based on the gold standard.
Yeah, gold.
Right, which
silver.
Which to me felt like, oh, okay, at least it's grounded in something tangible.
Yes.
And quantitative easing becomes far less abstract when that's possible, because hey, you've got to mine gold and make it into something.
Yeah.
But okay, given the inherent that you pointed out, mentioned a couple problems with the Bitcoin system, second party trust things. Like, to me, hearing you say it, those don't feel that major. They're not deal breakers.
No,
they're something we can live with, right?
Because the thing that's cool is this, right? Is that when you look at the transaction history, like no one's been able to say that's not what happened, which is like miraculous and astonishing.
Right.
And then the other thing that you need to look at is you kind of need to look at the cryptographic security of a wallet. So nobody's been able to point to a wallet and say, oh, somebody brute forced my wallet open using a big computer. It's like, no, that's happened 0 times, And so like, that's also very interesting. So I guess what I'm saying is that people talk about like, oh, Bitcoin collapsed. It's like, no, the price collapsed, but Bitcoin did not collapse. Like there's no, like everything worked perfectly.
Right.
Like the math worked, the software worked, flawlessly.
It didn't collapse as a result of the architecture.
No, it's just the price of a thing, and a speculative price at that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, your analysis of, well, if you're trying to develop a decentralized alternative financial infrastructure, so far Bitcoin seems to be a candidate, and it seems to be a viable candidate because it's continued to perform at $100+ billion levels of pressure test, and that's a very high amount of pressure.
That's
like the financial incentives for breaking that are like super high. Like people can very much profit from attacking it and killing it, and it's not been killed or attacked successfully.
So, but let's talk a little bit about the crash of the price itself, right? Mm-hmm. And for people who are they're using Bitcoin or whatever other cryptocurrency purely as an investment tool, not as a transactional one. Buy and hold kind of things.
Yeah.
How can we reconcile and kind of still infuse the wisdom and the inherent stability and like integrity of the architecture itself, which you say is intact, and it is, but with math, how much did it collapse? It was almost 200% or whatever it was.
Yeah. So one way of reasoning about Bitcoin is that it's very complex in terms of the participation forces, right? So in a sense, like it is, you know, if you think about avalanches and you think about collapses and you think about kind of like self-organized criticality, right? It's clear that decentralized systems are also subject to the exact same patterns, right? So, you know, you have people who are doing like algorithmic trading, you have people that are doing all kinds of technical trading, you have people doing basically the same kinds of things in Bitcoin that they did everywhere else. And so the thing that we need to understand is that collapse is an emergent property of nonlinear systems, full stop. So
yes.
I guess what I'm saying is it's not that a centralized system will magically be devoid of collapse, which is what we used to think. Like, you know, for many years that used to be the mantra of like, oh, don't worry, you know, the wizards will take care of it all. And no, they will not take care of it all. It's too complex for them to take care of it all. So, you know, the center can't hold and it collapsed on its own. But I think what we need to understand is that decentralized systems are also subject to the exact same market forces. So they are also collapsing. The thing that I think is important to understand is that they're decorrelated, I mean, up to a point. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if we get to the collapse of the scale where we're eating grass, you can't eat gold and you can't eat bitcoins, you can't eat electricity. So like everything goes to zero, right? So my point is that at certain scales, they're correlated, right? Which means, you know, if everything goes to zero, Bitcoin will go to zero. But on smaller scales, they may be decorrelated, right? So what you may have is you may have a shock absorber, right? Which is the centralized system may have a problem, and then the decentralized system starts to inflate. And the decentralized system may have a problem, and the centralized system starts to inflate, which is what we're seeing, right?
I see.
Like when you look at a trading pair like Bitcoin to USD, what you'll notice is that that's exactly what's happening, right? Which is that when Bitcoin has a problem, people sell and evacuate to USD, and then when USD has a problem, people may evacuate that and go towards Bitcoin. So like, and when I say USD, that's just one currency pair, because when you look at something like Brazil, there's a lot of volume, you know, in real to Bitcoin, or you look at Argentina, you know, you see Venezuela, Bolivar to Bitcoin.
Oh my God.
Those are currencies that are subject to a great deal more volatility and hyperinflation and magic money printing than the USD. And a lot of the people in those countries are like much more interested in achieving kind of transparent, consensual, mathematical stability. And I mean, stability is the wrong word, you know, mathematical, deflationary, predictable currencies, transparent currencies.
So we were talking about it a little bit before we rolled tape, about the idea of nature and what nature is, or what nature isn't, I suppose.
Yes.
To me, and this also goes hand in hand with artificial intelligence, but we'll get to that later. But the way the blockchain is manifested and exists in cyberspace, right? Like cyberspace to me, and this is not an original idea, but cyberspace to me is another dimension of reality, right? We've created
it's a place.
It's a place.
Yes.
As John Perry Barlow famously said, it's where we are when we're talking on the telephone. It's beautiful. It's a place. So to me, the fluctuations and the sort of organized chaos of Bitcoin living in this place is very symbolic of the way nature operates. Even, you know, nature's nonlinear and decentralized, and some species naturally evolve, collapse. You know, some plants sort of, you know, take hold somewhere, have no more food left for them to grow, they collapse and they morph into something else. So it feels to me that, like, even though the blockchain is it's a programmed entity that came from, you know, actual hard coding.
Yes.
It's still representative of a much more organic system.
Yeah, so I love the mindset. Here's the way I would characterize it. So you know, I think what we do see when we look into nature is something that's like very, very complex, that includes both kind of forces of centralization and forces of decentralization. But I think that when I reason about what's happened in the cryptographic asset space and the blockchain space, I can't help but to be informed by the evolution of open source software. So when you think about kind of like the emergence of this concept of open source software over the past, say, 30 years or so, you're really seeing something that is underlying almost all of the logic that drives the economy. Is now, I would say 90% of the logic that drives the economy is open source software code. Because it informs the base platforms, the databases, the networks, like so many pieces of open source software, so many lines of coded logic that are all based on openness, right? And so when you look into a repository like, GitHub, the world's biggest open source repository, it's really, you see almost immeasurable human value sitting in there essentially for free. Right. So to me, the thing that's so funny is that the only comparable system that generates order for free seems to be like the biosphere, right? So I think that the idea of, because the biosphere, and when I say you're getting order for free, right, like it's local reversal of entropy as a function of input. Right. So the question is there's an energetic input. That's the reason why. Like, you don't get all the plants and the animals and the entire biosphere for free. Like, that's not a thing. But what is a thing is that solar input is actually driving the creation of this. There's actually a wonderful physicist from MIT. I think his name is like Jeremy England or something like that. And he posits this notion that it's just the second law of thermodynamics, that all of life can be explained by people, that these are just molecules trying to beat the heat. So, he has a beautiful thing, which is, he says, if you shine light at a collection of atoms for a long enough time, you should not be surprised to see that it's turned into a plant.
Right? Yes, right. Okay.
And essentially,
in spite of itself, it's going to turn into a plant.
It's just going to turn into a plant.
Right.
Like, you've just been shining it for a long time.
Right.
And it's such a astonishing description of the biosphere, right? Because if you think about, the sun has been doing its thing for 4.6 billion years, and the Earth's been doing its thing for most of that time, So that's a real nice amount of time for stuff to happen, And so when you talk about nature and the emergence of nature, the metaphor of this notion of open source is that what you have is this system that seems to contribute structure. And if you look at it from the economic metaphor perspective, it's essentially happening for free, which is developers are writing software for free and they're giving it away for free, and the users are using it for free. So it's kind of like, the weirdness of it is almost the ecological, it's almost the equivalent of the biosphere from an economic perspective, right? Which is that open source software is just doing itself, right? It's all competing, it's all just going, right? It's all expanding, and that you're getting order, and it's quite astonishing.
That's an amazing thing. And what was the statistic you put out there? 90% of what?
Oh yeah, so that's so 87% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So so 90% of software is open source software. Here's what I'm saying, right? So if you take a look at something like Facebook, right? What is Facebook? So for example, all the things you can touch and see and feel in Facebook are written in this thing called React framework, which is a bunch of JavaScript, and it's a library, and it's a JavaScript library that Facebook open sourced. So, things like that. So, for example, you have these wonderful packages that handle memory inside of Facebook, and that's another package. So I guess what I'm saying is that Facebook over time has even built and even pushed out into open source big chunks of their infrastructure.
Right.
And then in addition, they've also taken open source software from the ecosystem and brought it in. Brought it in. So I guess what I'm saying is that whole
goes both ways.
And so what's happening is that crazy breathing that happens with large software companies. They're actually outputting open source, and then they're sucking in open source, and that kind of interaction with the biosphere of open source is a natural interaction, and it's really just the conservation of sequences.
Right.
So if you look at biological life, you'll find these sequences like cytochrome C, and it's every single organism on Earth has this DNA sequence. Every single DNA organism on Earth has a sequence, and it's That's pretty neat.
That's pretty neat. And Android is another one, right? It's then just
absolutely
expanding and contracting with open source.
It's just breathing, and open source is coming in and spewing out. And so I guess the reason why all these things kind of come to mind in this context is that we're really talking about the creation. When you talk about internet money, it cannot be other than open source money, right? In other words, like, there is no closed source internet money. Like, as soon as the source closes, it's not internet money, right? So to me, there are examples of, quote unquote blockchains that are quote unquote proprietary, that are closed source, and like, that's not internet. That's not the internet. The internet money is all open source because that's what the internet is.
That's what the internet is. Right?
Yeah, the internet is a set of agreements and a set of protocols, and it's agreements and protocols that everyone kind of can.
It's egalitarian in nature.
Correct. And you can't, it's all based on consent, right? So you can't, it's powered by consent, and you can't consent to something that you can't read or understand, or, you know what I mean? Like you have to read it and say, I agree to doing what it says.
Right, but part of the fascinating schism, I think, in the matrix around this is how well people respond to brands and what brands tell you to respond to. You take something like Uber or Lyft, right? And essentially, like, the same function that they provide, and I know there is an alternative out there, I forget what it's called, but it's purely P2P, and there is no centralized. Uber or Lyft is just a centralized entity to connect you with a driver. Right. I mean, it could be done peer to peer with an open source,
which it will at some point.
Which it will. Yeah. I know somebody's out there is doing it. Right. But this need, and I know you have a lot of experience with the consumer model as well. And products and what it means to be a consumer, and how it can just the layman consumer trusts. A piece of code that's wrapped up in a brand, right?
Yes.
So how do we go around that? It's kind of a vague question, but how can we get around that to sort of empower the people to understand that, hey, you don't need to give 70% of your Uber fare to this big company that just did this IPO. You can give it all to the driver and empower the person.
But so here's the joy of it, right? Which is that nature is inventive. And so when you really think about what is open source software and what is the energy source, right? Because the thing that, when we think about the metaphor of the biosphere, like, what exactly is the solar constant that's driving the production? And I can kind of give you my best metaphor, which is it's all fueled by consent, which is basically that developers consent to offer their time, and they build the software for free with no noticeable reward of any sort.
Right.
And the thing that's amazing is that they then offer the results to other developers typically, and the other developers use it to build whatever they want without paying anyone else any cent, right? But the thing that's interesting is that it's an evolutionary matrix that competes for consent. And the reason why I say it competes for consent is that there are thousands of open source projects that don't have usage, and they're effectively dead. And what happens is that, like, if you don't have usage, then developers kind of lose interest and they just kind of die. And so the thing that causes these projects to kind of burst into life is really the consent, and it's driven by this kind of, so to me, the thing that makes me hopeful is that if you look at these kind of so-called economic externalities, like, for example, things like the friction of centralization, an economic externality is just a cost that doesn't come with a consent. So the classic externality is getting polluted on, right? Because you're basically bearing the cost of someone polluting on your head, including like getting sick or not being able to breathe. But you never explicitly consented. You never signed a form saying, I would love to get polluted on. That's going to be so fun. And so that's called an economic externality. So the thing that's intriguing is if you imagine the evolutionary output of a matrix that competes for consent, the way it views an externality is it views an externality as an opportunity. because it's basically a way to get users. So what it would do is it would look and it would say, so what I'm really arguing is I'm arguing that when you look at things like open source money, all you're seeing financial infrastructure that's going to compete for users. And so what's going to happen as a result is that the infrastructure that serves the most people the best will have the most number of users and the most usage, right? So where does that arc go, right? So the thing that's really neat about the arc is that it kind of bends towards justice, or, as a function of competing for consent. So I guess to me, it's more of an emergent property that such systems naturally gravitate towards kind of consensual usage. So I'm optimistic about that natural tendency.
Well, let me ask you, this is about, it's not exactly the opposite of this, but in some ways it is. Like, I'm an Apple guy, I always have been, worked for Apple for some years, and, always admired Steve and all of this. And about the idea, Steve's thing was, keep it closed, control the experience. We don't want other people disrupting our experience by controlling every end of, form, function, inside and outside, that we can create this seamless, integrated, elegant, streamlined way of behaving within this cybernetic ecosystem that manages our information in a very specific way. And in Apple's case, it's effective, right? It works well. I know you can develop an app and get it on the App Store, but it's not open source. It's just an SDK. There's a difference, right? Yeah. But there's something to be said for that, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I guess the way I would look at it is this, right? Which is that, in a sense, what open source is it's kind of a form of pavement. And what I mean is that it effectively kind of commoditizes a space. So, for example, something like databases. Like databases, it's really hard to sell databases because there's so many good free ones, right? So, to me, what it does...
Larry seemed to do okay.
Yeah. Larry Ellison is, he's kind of squeezing the tail end of that whole phenomenon. Yeah. And he's kind of pivoting towards other things. But, I guess what I want to express, though, is that, if something is ragingly innovative, it tends to be proprietary and, filled with secrets, and that's, normal. So what happens with open source is open source moves in when something is very not moved. It's sort of a rolling stone gathers no moss, right? But if you look at things like the monetary system, like the software that powers transactions of credit cards, debit cards, ACH, Swift, that hasn't changed for decades.
For decades,
right? So
right?
So it's kind of could that be replaced by open source? It's it's super easy. That's so easy to replace with open source, and that's what's happening, is that all of those systems just haven't innovated. And so if you're gonna build an iPhone, maybe you should profit, right? In a way, it's sort of a reward for innovating and advancing, right? Okay. But the thing that happens that's kind of organic is that then an Android shows up and actually kind of crushes your margin, right? So at some point, Apple had better innovate again, or else they don't deserve to be the most valued company in the world, and eventually that value will come down, because unless they do something. Yeah, and that's, so to me, that's probably good, right? In the sense of they kind of monopolized that whole phone thing, and now they kind of can't, which I think is fine.
Yeah, I mean, it creates for a healthy discourse at the very least.
But what's cool about the open source thing is that what's happening is that we're getting commoditization. And the thing that's amazing is the idea that you can commoditize an institution like a bank. And the reason why I think that's fascinating is that you get to the point where bank infrastructure that's centralized requires so many staff and so much activity that the costs per acquisition of a user is pretty prohibitively high, which means you end up with a huge population of unbanked, right? Where the bank looks at the customers and says, yeah, it's really not worth it. Like we can't chase those customers because the customers are going to return very nominal value to the bank. And it's very expensive to acquire them, right? So basically, they're unbanked, right?
Right.
The thing that's fascinating about open source infrastructure is that we have these $10 Android phones, right? So we have like crazy infrastructure that's now being delivered into the periphery of our financial system. And so the ability for those systems to be inclusive is much higher because the cost of acquisition actually can be reduced like crazily,
exponentially.
Right? You can get crazily low cost of acquisition through things like word of mouth, right? So if someone is in a country like Zimbabwe where the currency is collapsed entirely, if they hear about something like this, they may want to try it, and if it starts working, then everyone will start using it. Right. So I guess what I'm saying is that the idea that we can create and commoditize very slow moving and slow evolving functions in our economy, like that seems favorable.
It does. It does seem favorable.
It seems like a positive direction.
So, continuing with this thread of nature's model as it relates to technology, the thing with AI, and it's referred to as artificial intelligence, the thing that's always, I guess, bothered me about the premise is the name artificial intelligence, the artificial part. Because, and you're being a spiritualist like I am, if human beings are organic and everything we create is an extension of us, everything that we create is a form of nature. It's just like an apple.
It's the observable. Yes.
It's the observable. An apple grows from a tree. This microphone grows from a human, essentially. It comes from our mind. So it's not artificial intelligence. It's augmented intelligence. It's just this form of intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it because we created it, right?
Yes.
So because of that, well, I guess this depends about what you think of human nature. Are we destined to evolve and figure out our mess? Are we doomed? That's up for the listener to decide. But that being said, AI to me is just an extension of evolution. What's AI to you?
Yeah, so I love the question, and one of the things I love about your framing is that I'm of Japanese origin in terms of my parents and their heritage, and I've been studying Japanese philosophy, and one of the things that did not happen in Japan is the emergence of this kind of the philosophy of Descartes and the Cartesian split, right? So essentially this notion of the separation of mind and body and the separation of humans from nature, is really not an intrinsic and indigenous part. So what you have in Japan is an intact indigenous paganism in the form of the Shinto religion.
Right.
And then you have a superimposed external spirituality called Buddhism that is actually non-colonial. So that's the really weird...
the beauty of it.
That's the difference, right?
Yes,
so essentially what happened is that you get this strange coexistence of Buddhism layered on top of Shintoism. So Shintoism is like all pagan systems, it's nature worship. So the thing that's great is that you actually have no separation between humans and nature. And in a way, when you think about the soul of Japanese technology, it's really a connection, right? And what I mean is, like, you look at these things, like they have like robot dogs that are, have intelligence. They have the Wii motion controller. They have kind of the hybrid car engine. They
robot
have
sex dolls and everything.
Yes, they have toilets that like automatically wash your butt. And like all of that is non-separation. All of that is coming from kind of this notion that humans, nature, and technology are all actually just one thing. It's one continuous thing. So I think from that perspective, I think that I think that that's for sure a good lens, and I think that this notion of artificiality, I think, is itself artificial. But I do think that the thing we need to understand is I think we need to understand the effects of automation on society and culture and kind of the meaning of work, right? Because, the thing that's fascinating about what's emerging is that we're starting to see an emerging conversation around, Andrew Yang, who's a presidential candidate, is talking about universal basic income.
Right?
Yeah. Fascinating topic, because what happens if the traditional work that we've been doing is no longer offered to us as a function of combination of robotic automation and automation of functions that we typically consider to be knowledge work. So, at that point, what's left to do? And obviously there's many things, including human expression and art and things. But the question is, how do we value that?
How do we value that? And, I got curious once, and I went back as best as one can, and I looked at, this phenomenon around every single major advancement of the human condition, the agrarian age, industrial age. If you go back and look at some of the coverage that was sort of somewhat based in reality and somewhat based in fear when the cotton gin became, the tool of choice for all cotton farmers.
Great invention.
Great invention, right? But it immediately reduced the need for the number of employees.
Slash slaves.
Yeah, slash slaves.
I mean, that slaves. Was a historically dark form of labor.
Yeah.
An evil form.
Yeah, no question about it. But that aside, I think the equation was 7-to-1. For every 7 employees needed, 1 was needed because of the cotton gin.
Yes, the cotton gin.
So I think human beings, as far as we've seen so far, we have this ability to reinvent. Well, I like Andrew Yang's universal basic income. I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Mainly because of the idea, not because of automation, but because of the idea of wealth disparity. But we have this need to reinvent. So I don't know. I feel like there's going to be new forms of industry, new forms of thinking, new forms of expression that will come up out of the woodwork, and people will still have things to do.
Yeah, and I think that our brains are meaning generating, and I think that you're absolutely right. It's a very nice, it's a softer mindset around it.
Yeah,
I think people who are peddling more
the fear-based stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, but are you, just to have the conversation, are you worried about robots from the future coming to kill us? Is that a real thing?
I like that. That's funny. That's good from the Terminator movies. But I guess to kind of try to ground that question, I guess what I would say is the following, right? Which is that historically, having a large unemployed labor force and then kind of erosion of economic growth is correlated with the emergence of warfare, right? So I guess to me, there are kind of reasons to be concerned, because people need to feel secure in their economic well-being, and I think automation is a thing. I think it's a so to me, we do need answers. We do need ways of confronting this and kind of imagining something that's better.
Imagining something that's better and perhaps more integrated, right? As opposed to looking at it as something that's separate.
Yeah, I say more.
Well, that I think so much of the fear around AI is that it's going to be A, dangerous, and B, it's going to replace us. Whereas I would say it's not dangerous, and it's something that we can work with.
Yeah, I guess kind of in a rounding out this conversation about AI, one of the things that's emerging in Japan that I think is a wonderful innovation is actually caretaking robots.
Right? That's a great example.
Because you have you have aging population,
yes,
right?
You do. Right?
And then you kind of have this sort of issue of how do you kind of take care, right?
Yeah.
And the thing that's fascinating is that, with this Japanese mindset, the mindset is basically that there is no separation between nature and technology. And so the idea that a machine can take care is valid, right? Now, obviously, like, people need friends and family, and they need this kind of limbic co-regulation and warmth and
Sure.
human contact and oxytocin. But, like, as far as, like, you know, taking someone to the restroom and, you know, doing, like, functions, like, for sure these humanoid robots can perform those functions, you know, and that they don't sleep and they don't blink and they don't complain and they don't take breaks. So
And they don't need to get paid.
yeah. So at some level, they're doing like extremely valuable service, and that the way that these things can pay attention to humans is actually pretty extraordinary, right? It's an unblinking devotional servant in some level. Like, it's just a very strange experience.
But it's better than the slave at the cotton gin.
Indeed, because, you know, it sort of gets to consent.
Well, Miko, thank you for doing this.
Of course.
It's been great.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, man.